The saint was not supposed to bleed. Her body was meant to be the vessel of light, the living will of the Emperor himself. Yet here she stood, alone among the ashes of a ruined shrine world, her hands trembling beneath the weight of her own sanctity. The air still shimmered with the dying echoes of faith. Once a golden blaze, now fading embers that could not warm her anymore. The vox relays whispered her name in reverence across the sector, but she no longer dared to answer. For the first time in centuries, a living saint looked into the burning sun and felt nothing. No divine warmth, no whispered purpose, only silence. If the Emperor truly watched, then why did his light no longer reach her? And if he did not, then what exactly had she been serving all this time? If you find yourself drawn into the quiet horror of that question, the dread of faith unraveling in the farthest corners of the Imperium, then stay. Lend your attention as you would lend a prayer. Like, share, and subscribe, not for vanity, but to keep this tale alive, because in the grim darkness of the far future, even stories can be a form of salvation. The war was over, but the air still burned. Ash drifted through the ruins of Sanctus Virelia like the ghosts of prayers. The saint stood upon a mound of shattered masonry, her armor cracked and scorched, her wings dimmed to embers. Around her, the faithful screamed her name, Celestine, deliverer of light. Their voices roar with devotion, their faces lit by the dying glow of bombardment fires. She should have felt it, the pulse of the Emperor's grace coursing through her veins, that fierce golden certainty that made her more than mortal. But now there was nothing, only the cold bite of the wind against her skin and the scent of burnt flesh rising from the field. She lifted her sword, the blade still warm from divine fire, and for a moment she thought she saw it gutter. The miracle had worked. The heretics lay dead. The Imperium had triumphed again, and yet she felt hollow. Saint Celestine, came a voice from below. Sister Livia, her armor dented, her eyes wide with awe. The Emperor's will is fulfilled. The enemy is purged. Celestine looked down at her, her lips parted to bless the warrior, to utter the words she had spoken for centuries. The Emperor protects. But when she tried to speak, her throat tightened. The words felt foreign, like lines in a forgotten script. She forced them out anyway, a whisper shaped by habit, not faith. The Emperor protects. Livia bowed, trembling as though touched by revelation. She did not see the saint's hands shake. The battlefield stretched before them in ruin. The manufactorum spires were broken like ribs, their skeletal silhouettes reaching toward a crimson sky. Smoke rose from the corpses of the fallen, imperial and traitor alike. Celestine moved among them, her wings trailing faint light, each step heavy with something she could not name. She had walked these fields 1,000 times, always radiant, always sure, but now the ground seemed to reject her. Her halo dimmed, flickering in rhythm with her pulse. She knelt beside a dying guardsman. His eyes were glazed with faith, his lips forming her name. "My lady, I saw you descend, light all around you." His hand reached for hers, trembling. "Tell me, it was real, wasn't it? The Emperor's light?" Celestine hesitated. Once, she would have answered without doubt. Now she searched herself and found only silence. The golden warmth that had always accompanied her, that living presence, was gone. "It was real," she said softly because he needed to hear it. He smiled, exhaled once, and died. A single tear slipped from her eye, vanishing before it could touch her cheek. For a moment she envied him. Faith had carried him to the end, unbroken. Hers was already crumbling. The air shuddered with the echo of distant thunder, the last artillery barrage fading into the mountains. Celestine turned toward the horizon, where the sun should have been. Instead, there was only a dull red haze. She tried to call upon the Emperor's light, to draw that familiar fire into her soul. Nothing came. The relics at her belt were cold. The hymns she whispered felt like lies. Behind her, the Sisters of Battle began their litany of triumph, voices rising in reverence. Celestine listened, feeling each word like a blade twisting in her chest. They still believed. They still saw her as divine, and so she smiled for them, raised her sword high, and let the crowd's faith fill the silence that the Emperor once occupied. In that moment, she understood something terrible, that their belief was stronger than her own, and that without it, she might fade entirely. As the day waned, Celestine ascended to the ruined spire of the basilica, seeking solitude. The wind was sharp up there, carrying the scent of promethium and sanctified oil. The city was dying, not from war, but from the absence of faith that followed it. Victories were supposed to rekindle hope, but this one had drained it instead. She felt it in the air, in the eyes of the wounded, in her own heart. The Emperor's light had not abandoned them, it had simply gone silent, and in that silence, she heard something else. Faint, formless, yet unmistakably real, a whisper. It was not holy, nor was it kind. It spoke no words, only breathed across her thoughts like ash stirred by wind. Celestine turned toward the horizon, searching the endless ruins for the source, but there was nothing, only the dying light of a sun that refused to set. And for the first time since her ascension, she felt afraid. Morning came without warmth. The sun, dimmed by ash clouds, crawled across the horizon like a dying ember. Within the shattered cloister of the basilica, the Sisters of Battle gathered in solemn prayer, their hymns echoing through fractured columns. The sound should have comforted Celestine. It always had. But now it grated against her thoughts like the grinding of rusted gears. Every word of praise pressed upon her chest, heavy and undeserved. They looked at her as though she were salvation incarnate. Every glance was reverence, every breath a whispered prayer. To them, she was proof that the Emperor still watched over his children. To her, those eyes were mirrors, reflecting the faith she had lost. Sister Livia approached, helmet clasped beneath her arm, her expression torn between devotion and exhaustion. "My lady," she said softly, "the wounded await your blessing. Many yet cling to life by his mercy. They will not close their eyes until you have walked among them." Celestine nodded. The gesture felt mechanical, like the motion of a servitor. She descended from the dais, wings folded close, light dim and trembling. The sisters parted as she passed, bowing their heads, whispering praises that sounded more like pleas. The infirmary was a cathedral of suffering. Rows of soldiers lay on makeshift cots, Astra Militarum troopers, Sisters Hospitaller, even a few Scitari, whose augmetics sparked and hissed in the incense-heavy air. Celestine moved among them, her shadow falling across the dying. She raised her hand, murmured a benediction, and pressed her palm to a guardsman's brow. Nothing happened. The man stared at her with fever-bright eyes, waiting for the warmth, the holy glow that once poured from her touch. Celestine felt panic coil in her chest. She forced herself to smile, whispered again, louder this time. Still nothing. The man's breath rattled, shallow, weak, and then, faintly, desperately, she willed it. She begged silently for the Emperor's light, for the fire that once came so easily. A spark answered, a flicker of gold that danced across her fingers and vanished like smoke. The soldier gasped in wonder, believing it enough. "He hears me," he whispered, before slipping into stillness. Celestine withdrew her hand, trembling. The glow had been hers, not divine, but human. A spark of will, of memory, and even that had nearly broken her. Sister Livia, watching from the archway, crossed herself with the sign of the Aquila. "Your miracles never fail, my lady." Celestine turned away before her expression betrayed her. Miracles, the word felt hollow. If only Livia knew how close the light had come to dying entirely. As she moved on, she passed a group of novitiates kneeling in prayer, their young faces gaunt from fasting. One of them, no older than 17, lifted her gaze and whispered, "Saint Celestine, is it true that you see the Emperor's face when you close your eyes?" The saint hesitated. Once, she had told that story often, the blinding brilliance, the voice like thunder and sunlight intertwined. But when she closed her eyes now, she saw only shadow. "I see his will," Celestine replied, her voice quiet, steady, though not always clearly. The novitiate smiled, content with the answer, and returned to her prayer. Celestine lingered there, surrounded by faith that was no longer hers. She felt like a thief in the house of worship, stealing belief just to survive. Every hymn, every prayer directed toward her, fed the illusion that she still carried the Emperor's grace. And perhaps, she thought bitterly, that was all faith ever was. A beautiful illusion shared by the desperate. She retreated to the basilica's inner sanctum as dusk fell. The chamber was lined with statues of martyrs and saints, stone eyes forever fixed in serene conviction. She envied them. They could not doubt. They could not feel the slow unmaking of faith. At the center of the chamber stood a sister dialogues, recording her every word and movement upon a cracked data slate. "Your presence must be preserved, Holy One," the scribe murmured. "The words you speak are doctrine, every syllable sacred." Celestine paused before the ancient recorder. "Erase today's entry," she said. The scribe's eyes widened behind her lenses. "But erase it," Celestine repeated, her tone soft but unyielding. "There is nothing holy in silence." The dialoguist bowed her head, uncertain, fingers trembling as she complied. Celestine turned away before the woman could see the weariness carved across her face. She ascended once more to the basilica roof, where the night burned with the color of iron and fire. The banners of the ecclesiarchy hung tattered in the wind, the imperial aquila half torn. Below, the people sang hymns of victory. Their faith rose into the heavens like smoke, and as she watched them, she realized the cruel truth. It was their faith that kept her alive, not the Emperor's light. Each prayer, each whisper of belief bound her to this world like a tether of gold. Without them, she would fall. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that revelation settle into her bones. When she opened them again, tears glimmered briefly upon her cheeks. Not of grief, but of understanding. The Emperor had not abandoned her. He simply no longer needed her to believe. Night had settled like a funeral shroud over Sanctis Virelia. The basilica's fires guttered low, leaving the vast halls in twilight shadow. Celestine knelt before the ruined altar, her armor laid aside, her wings folded close as though ashamed of their dimming glow. The marble floor was slick with candle wax and dried blood. Around her, incense coiled like smoke from a dying censer. The scent was heavy, cloying, a reminder of how often men had tried to sweeten death with ritual. Before her, the great image of the Emperor stared down, fractured mosaic eyes gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Once she had seen compassion there. Now she saw judgment, the kind that waited in silence rather than speech. Her lips moved, but the words that came were hollow, stripped of power. "My lord, your servant awaits your voice." She bowed her head. Only the crackle of distant fire answered. She tried again, louder this time. "You have guided me through flame and death. You have made me your instrument. If I falter now, the faithful will fall with me. So speak, I beg you." Her voice echoed against the high stone vaults, unanswered, uncaring. Celestine clenched her hands until the skin split at her palms. The wounds did not glow. No fire burned beneath the flesh. She tasted iron and dust, a human taste. For the first time in centuries, she felt small, terribly small, and real. A wind stirred through the shattered stained glass, carrying whispers from the battlefield below. Pilgrims sang hymns in her name. Their voices, distant but devout, wove together into a single, trembling chorus. It should have comforted her. It only deepened the void. She rose slowly, her movements deliberate, as though gravity itself resisted her. The altar before her was cracked. The aquila split down its center. The candles wavered and died one by one until only darkness remained. "Is this my punishment?" she whispered. "For pride? For doubt?" The silence was not empty. It was listening. She could feel it pressing in, vast and sentient. Something was awake in the void between her thoughts. From the far side of the chamber came a faint sound. Not a footstep. Not exactly. More like the rustle of wings brushing stone. Celestine turned sharply, her sword half drawn, its surface catching a weak gleam of light. Nothing. Only the cold outline of the Emperor's statue, towering and still, and yet she felt it again. That whisper, that impossible presence. Not words, but breath upon her mind. It carried neither warmth nor comfort. It felt old, older than her, older than the Imperium. A thing that had watched saints rise and fall and never spoken once. Her heart pounded. "If you are not him," she said quietly, "then what are you?" The shadows did not move, but the silence thickened, became weight, became pressure. For a heartbeat, her vision blurred, and the mosaic Emperor seemed to smile, not in kindness, but in something colder. Recognition, perhaps. Celestine stumbled back. The sword fell from her grasp and struck the marble with a ringing note that echoed far longer than it should have. The sound rippled through the chamber like a distant scream. She clutched her temples, breathing hard. Her mind flooded with images she did not summon. Fire and gold, chains and thrones, faces without eyes whispering prayers into endless dark. When it passed, she was kneeling again, shaking. Her wings had lost the last of their glow. The feathers, once radiant, looked dull and grey. A single word slipped from her lips, unbidden. "Why?" It was not the voice of a saint that spoke. It was the voice of a woman, tired, frightened, reaching for a faith that no longer reached back. In that moment, the silence shifted, not breaking but answering. The candles flickered to life for an instant, blue and unnatural. The shadows twisted against the walls, taking vague shapes, robed, faceless, kneeling toward the altar. Phantoms of devotion, echoes of prayers long spent. They did not speak. They simply stared at her, as though waiting for something she could no longer give. Celestine rose unsteadily, her breath visible in the chill. The phantoms watched her until she took a step forward, then dissolved into smoke. The altar cracked further. The Emperor's mosaic shattered with a soft, final sigh. Outside, thunder rolled across the heavens, distant and cold. The war was finished, but something else had begun. Celestine gathered her sword and turned from the ruined altar. Her face was pale, eyes hollow. There was no revelation, no divine command, only the unbearable truth that perhaps the Emperor had never spoken at all. She left the basilica without a word. The sisters saw her passing and fell to their knees, whispering prayers as her dim halo flickered in the dark. None of them noticed that, for the first time, the saint did not bless them. The night swallowed her silhouette, wings dim as embers, and in that void between prayers, she finally understood the shape of her new faith, not in light, not in divinity, but in survival. The dawn after her silence was a wound all its own. It broke across the ruins of Sanctus Virelia like a blade of pale light, illuminating the twisted bones of Manufactorum towers and the blackened corpses that dotted the valley below. Celestine walked among them without her retinue, her armor unpolished, her wings wrapped tight like a cloak of ash. She did not shine anymore, and the world seemed to prefer it that way. The dead had been gathered in uneven rows, awaiting consecration. The sisters sang soft litanies, voices weary from endless prayer. The scent of promethium hung thick in the morning air, fuel for the pyres, holy fire for the nameless. Celestine's gaze lingered on the bodies of the faithful, sisters of battle she had fought beside, guardsmen who had chanted her name even as they bled out. Their devotion had been pure, unquestioning, and she could not feel it anymore. She reached out to brush the face of a fallen sister, her fingers trembling as she traced the soot-stained aquila carved into the woman's armor. Beneath her touch, the metal was still warm, a memory of the battle's flame. But it was not divine warmth, it was only heat. A cry broke from behind her. A sister hospitaller struggling to lift a wounded soldier from the rubble. Celestine moved without thought, her instincts older than her doubt. She wrenched away a beam of ferrocrete, the weight groaning in protest, and freed the man beneath. His leg was crushed, his eyes wild with pain. "Easy," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "The Emperor watches." The words left her mouth before she realized what she had said. They felt strange, heavy, false. Still, the soldier's breathing slowed. He looked at her with awe. "You're real," he whispered. "You're really here." Celestine smiled, a small, hollow thing, and reached for the shard of metal lodged in his thigh. As she pulled it free, it slipped and cut across her palm. She hissed. The pain was immediate, sharp, alive. A crimson bead welled up, sliding down her wrist. She froze. Her blood, real blood, dark, unholy, mortal. She stared as it dripped onto the rubble, staining the ground like an accusation. For centuries, her wounds had sealed before she could even feel them. The Emperor's light had always burned away pain, burned away imperfection, but now the cut remained, and it hurt. The soldier, delirious, did not notice. "You'll save me," he murmured. "You always do." Celestine tore a strip of cloth from her robe and bound his leg, her hands trembling. The bandage darkened quickly, his lifeblood seeping through. "Rest," she whispered. "You're safe now." He tried to smile, but death was quicker. His eyes went still before she could speak another lie. Celestine remained kneeling beside him long after his body cooled. The cut in her hand burned like blasphemy. She pressed her palm against the wound, waiting for the familiar warmth, the divine fire that once sealed her flesh with light. Nothing came. When she finally rose, she felt the weight of the world pressing against her shoulders, gravity reclaiming what faith had once defied. The realization came with a quiet horror. She was no longer beyond the reach of pain. She was becoming human again. Later, within the shadowed nave of the basilica, she hid the wound beneath her gauntlet. Her attendants saw nothing. Their eyes refused to. To them, she was still perfect, unscarred, untouchable. The illusion held because it needed to. Sister Livia approached with a data slate, her voice reverent but cautious. "My lady, the canoness requests word of your next miracle." "The wounded await your healing hand." Celestine said nothing. The gauntlet felt too heavy, her skin burning beneath it. "Tell them to pray," she murmured at last. Livia hesitated. "They do, my lady, but they say their prayers work only when you are near." Celestine looked at her, and for the first time, Livia saw something in her eyes that made her take a step back. "Not wrath, not weariness, but fear. Then let them pray louder," Celestine said. "Perhaps the Emperor will hear them before he hears me." She turned away before the sister could respond, retreating into the basilica's inner sanctum. There, alone beneath the towering effigy of the golden throne, she peeled off her gauntlet. The wound had deepened, black veins spidering from the cut like cracks in glass. She pressed her hand against her chest, feeling the weak rhythm of her heart, the same pulse as any mortal's. It should not have been possible. A living saint did not bleed. A living saint did not bruise. She whispered a litany of healing, her voice trembling as she tried to summon the flame within. The words dissolved into silence. The candlelight flickered, throwing the statue's shadow across her. For a moment she thought it moved, leaning closer as though watching. She sank to her knees, clutching her wounded hand. "Why?" she breathed. "If I am yours, why do you make me bleed?" The silence answered her again, vast and patient. And beneath it, something else stirred, something that did not belong to him. The prisoner was brought before her at dusk. They said he was a heretic preacher, a blasphemer who had turned whole regiments against the creed before the battle's end. His sermon had been cut short by bolter fire, yet he still lived, whispering corruption through blood-flecked teeth. Celestine had demanded to see him alone. The canoness had objected, of course. A saint should not descend into the mire of heresy. But Celestine insisted. She needed to hear what kind of madness could make men turn from the Emperor in the shadow of his miracles. The chamber was small and unlit, save for a single lumen flickering overhead. The air stank of rust, oil, and the faint sweetness of decay. The prisoner knelt in chains, his robes blackened by soot. His face was half burned, half beautiful, the ruin of faith etched into flesh. When he looked up, his eyes were lucid, too lucid. "So," he rasped, smiling through the ruin of his jaw, "the Saint of Light comes to listen to the dark." Celestine did not answer. She stood over him, her wings folded like shadows. "You spat upon his name. You led men into damnation. Speak quickly before I lose patience." He laughed, a sound like cracking bone. "You mistake me, Saint. I did not lead them away from the Emperor. I led them toward the truth beneath him." "Blasphemy," she said, the word colder than steel. "Is it?" He tilted his head, studying her. "Tell me when you pray." "Does he answer?" Her silence betrayed her. The man's smile widened. "Ah, I thought so. The throne burns, the Astronomicon flickers, and yet you, his blessed avatar, hear only silence. Perhaps it is not you who have failed. Perhaps the silence is the Emperor." Celestine stepped closer, her voice low and venomous. "You do not understand what you speak of." "I understand enough," he said. "I was a priest once. I preached his glory for 30 years, until I realized the light we worship was not divinity, but reflection. The faith of billions projected upon a corpse. We built a god from our own desperation, and you, Saint, are its most perfect lie." The words struck like blades, finding the soft places she could not defend. She wanted to smite him, to end the blasphemy before it spread any further. But something held her hand. The certainty of righteousness was gone. All that remained was the echo of it. "You see doubt as wisdom," she said at last, her voice trembling between fury and sorrow. "But doubt is rot. It eats the soul from within." "Rot?" he echoed, leaning forward. "No, Saint, rot is what happens when faith refuses to die. You are decaying because you will not let go of what was never real." Celestine's gauntlet clenched. The wound beneath it throbbed, a pulse of pain that seemed to answer his every word. "You seek meaning in heresy," she hissed. "There is none." The prisoner smiled faintly, and for a moment she could almost see what he had once been. A man who believed, who prayed, who waited for the same voice she longed to hear. "Perhaps not," he said softly, But if the Emperor is truly silent, then faith is no longer obedience. It becomes choice, and choice, Saint, is where divinity truly begins. His words hung in the air like incense smoke, bitter, intoxicating. Celestine turned away. "You are condemned," she said, though her voice faltered. "Your words will burn with you. Then remember them while you watch me burn," he murmured. She signaled the guards. They dragged him away, his laughter echoing down the corridor. Not triumphant, not mad, but strangely peaceful. When the door sealed, Celestine leaned against the cold stone wall, her breath unsteady. His laughter lingered in her mind like a hymn sung backward. If the Emperor is silent, then faith is choice. The thought burrowed deep, refusing to leave. That night, as she removed her armor, the wound on her palm reopened. Blood welled again, slow and dark. She stared at it, remembering the prisoner's ruined smile. For a moment, she considered pressing her bleeding hand against the symbol of the Aquila carved into her chestplate, to see which was stronger, flesh or faith. Instead, she wrapped the hand in linen and whispered a single prayer, not for healing, not for forgiveness, for understanding. The silence that answered was not empty this time. It was listening, and in that listening, she thought she heard faint words, not from the Emperor, but from the dying man's voice, echoing in memory. Perhaps divinity begins when the lie no longer works. Celestine sat in the dark until the candles burned low, her armor gleaming faintly in the glow. The flame trembled, as if caught between worship and extinction. So, she thought, was she. The enemy returned at dusk, descending upon the ruins like a storm reborn. They were remnants, broken, starving, desperate. Yet still they came, drawn by hatred older than reason. The skies howled with drop shells and smoke. Voxcasters screamed liturgies of vengeance, each voice blending into a single thunderous prayer for deliverance. Celestine led from the front, as she always had. Her wings flared, catching the glow of explosions like molten glass. Her blade sang through the air, a comet of steel and flame. The sisters followed in formation, their hymns rising in perfect rhythm with the pounding of heavy bolters. For a moment, it felt real again. The old rhythm of faith and fury, the music of righteous slaughter. But the illusion cracked when she felt the first hint of exhaustion. It came like a whisper beneath her armor, the tremor of human limitation she had forgotten existed. Her sword grew heavy, her vision blurred. The divine fire that once poured endlessly through her veins now sputtered like a candle caught in wind. A shell burst nearby, tearing through the flank of the formation. Sister Livia was thrown to the ground, her armor split open. Celestine turned instinctively, lifting her sword to call the Emperor's light, to bring the healing fire that had saved her companions 1,000 times before. She raised her hand, summoned the words, the will, nothing. The power that once answered her instantly now lingered out of reach, like a name half forgotten. She tried again, forcing the prayer through gritted teeth. The air trembled. A flicker of gold shimmered at her fingertips, but it was weak, pitiful. Livia's blood pooled beneath her, bright against the ash. "Saint, please!" Livia gasped, eyes wide with fear. Celestine pressed her palms to the wound, but the light refused to come. "The Emperor protects," she whispered. Once, twice, over and over, until the words lost all meaning. Livia's breathing slowed. The glow faded from her eyes. Celestine stayed kneeling long after the life had gone from the sister's body, her hands stained with mortal blood. Around her, the battle raged. The sisters faltered without their saint's fire. The enemy surged forward, chanting their own blasphemous hymns. Celestine rose, the silence inside her louder than the war around her. Her sword hung limp at her side. Then came the blow. A traitor's bolter round struck her shoulder, spinning her backward. The pain was electric, shocking, raw, real. Her body slammed into the debris, armor cracking. She gasped, half in disbelief. The divine flame should have shielded her. It always had. Instead, she bled. The smell of it, copper and dust, filled her senses. For the first time, she understood the terror of mortality, not as an observer, but as one condemned to it. She rose slowly, her breath ragged. Around her, the sisters shouted prayers through tears, fighting to protect her broken form. The traitors closed in, their faces twisted by faith inverted. their laughter echoing like the roar of demons. Celestine gripped her sword tighter. She willed the light to return, to burn away her doubt, her pain, her flesh. She screamed his name into the smoke, and for a heartbeat, the fire answered. It erupted from her like a dying sun, searing through the fog of battle. The nearest traitors were turned to ash where they stood. The ground cracked beneath her feet. The sisters cried out in awe, but it was not the Emperor's light. It was hers, raw, desperate, human, and it burned her. She felt it devour her from within, the agony exquisite and endless. Her wings flared white-hot, feathers turning to embers. Her voice broke as she swung her sword one last time, carving through the tide of enemies until her strength failed utterly. When the smoke cleared, she stood in a ring of scorched earth. Her armor blackened, her halo shattered. The survivors fell to their knees, calling it a miracle. Celestine did not answer. She collapsed beside the fallen, her body trembling. The wound in her shoulder pulsed with each beat of her heart, blood mixing with ash. Above her, the sky burned with false dawn, the light of orbital fires, not the Emperor's grace. She watched it, eyes half closed, and realized the truth. Her faith had not left her. She had left it. The fire she wielded was no longer divine. It was the last echo of a woman refusing to die. The sky above Sanctus Virilia never cleared. Even weeks after the war had ended, the clouds hung low and red, a perpetual twilight that turned the world into a wound that would not close. Celestine left under that dying sky, her wings bound beneath a heavy cloak, her armor veiled by dust. No procession followed her, no hymns announced her departure. She slipped away like a shadow, leaving behind the basilica where her faith had burned to embers. The sisters did not understand. They believed she had gone to commune with the Emperor, to seek renewal at Terra's feet. They prayed for her swift return, for miracles reborn. But she did not travel as a saint. She traveled as a penitent. The pilgrim ship Reliquary of Dawn was an ancient craft, once a shrine vessel, now a rusted ark, ferrying the desperate through the void. Its decks groaned with the weight of thousands who sought redemption, healing, or escape. The air was thick with incense and decay. Prayers murmured without pause, their rhythm matching the slow heartbeat of the ship's reactors. Celestine moved among them unnoticed. The faithful knelt before cracked icons, clutching their relics. Splinters of saints, dried tears, feathers they claimed fell from her own wings. They prayed for salvation, never knowing she walked among them barefoot, silent. Her once radiant eyes dimmed to human hue. In the lower decks, where the air recycled too thin and the lights flickered like dying candles, she found a group of children drawing the imperial aquila on the metal floor with bits of ash. One looked up at her, face gaunt but smiling. "The saint will save us," the girl said. "They say she can hear our prayers even in the warp." Celestine knelt beside her, voice soft. "Do you believe that?" The girl nodded fiercely. "Of course. She walks with the Emperor. He tells her what to do." Celestine looked at the crude aquila, its lines trembling under the child's small hands. And if she couldn't hear him anymore? The child frowned, confused. Then she'd listen harder. Celestine smiled faintly, but the warmth did not reach her eyes. "Yes," she murmured. "Perhaps she would." As the ship drifted through the void, storms flared in the warp, silent lightning streaking across the viewing ports. The Geller field groaned under unseen pressure. Pilgrims clutched their icons tighter, whispering louder, feeding the machine of faith that kept them sane. Celestine watched them, her thoughts heavy with guilt. Once, her presence alone had been shield enough. Now she was as powerless as any of them. In the ship's chapel, a confessor stood before a congregation, his voice cracking from exhaustion. "Do not despair," he cried. "Even when the Emperor does not answer, he hears. The silence is a test, my children. Faith untested is faith unworthy." The crowd murmured assent, though their eyes were hollow. Celestine lingered in the shadows, listening. Every word felt like an echo of her own lies. The confessor's fervor faltered when he noticed her in the back. A tall, hooded figure, unmoving. His eyes widened, though he did not know her name. He only knew the weight of holiness when it entered a room. He finished the sermon quickly and approached her after the crowd dispersed. "You carry a presence," he said quietly. "Are you—" "No one," she replied. He studied her. "No one does not carry sorrow like that." Celestine lowered her hood. Her hair, once gold, now dull and streaked with ash, caught the dim light. "Tell me, Father," she said, "do you hear him when you pray?" The confessor hesitated, lips parting but no words coming. Then softly, "I hear the silence, and in it, I choose to believe." She considered his answer, turning it over like a blade in her mind. "And if the silence is not a test?" she asked. "If it is simply absence?" The man's eyes filled with quiet fear, the kind that faith cannot hide. "Then the absence itself must be holy," he whispered, as though convincing himself. Celestine said nothing. The hum of the ship filled the gap between them. When she finally turned to leave, the confessor sank to his knees, unsure whether he had spoken to a woman or a ghost. Later, in her narrow berth, Celestine watched the void through a small viewport. The warp storms outside shimmered like veins of fire, pulsing with impossible color. For a moment, she thought she saw faces forming in the light. Not demonic, not divine, but human. Billions of souls crying out in prayer, their faith painting the darkness with fragile gold. It struck her then. Perhaps the Emperor's silence was not neglect, but deafness. Drowned beneath the endless noise of mortal belief. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer she did not expect to be heard. For the first time in her long, unending life, she prayed not for strength, not for victory, but for forgiveness. And somewhere in the depths of the ship, a child's voice echoed softly through the vents, repeating her words without knowing why. The reliquary of dawn drifted through the void for weeks, caught between the edge of real space and the murmuring skin of the warp. The engines throbbed like a heartbeat too slow to sustain life. In the flickering half-light of the corridors, the pilgrims whispered their prayers without rhythm now, more habit than hope. Celestine moved among them unseen, her hood drawn low. She had become another voice in the murmur, another silhouette beneath the dying lumen strips. When the ship's chapel bells rang each cycle, she listened from the threshold, but did not enter. The old hymns had begun to sound different to her, like echoes of ghosts who still believed they were alive. One evening, she found herself standing before a confession booth at the far end of the hold. It was old, iron-walled, the sigils half scraped away by years of touch. Inside sat a confessor whose voice she had heard during the last sermon, hoarse, fervent, trembling with exhaustion. He did not see her face as she stepped inside, only the dim outline of a pilgrim cloaked in shadow. "Child," he said gently, "speak your burden." Celestine hesitated. "I have failed my faith. All of us fail," he murmured. "But confession is the Emperor's mirror. Look into it and you will see how he still loves you." "I don't think he looks back anymore," she said. Her voice quivered before she could master it. "I prayed, and there was only silence." The priest's hand tightened on the grill between them. "Silence is not absence. It is the sound of his patience. The Emperor waits for us to listen. Or perhaps he is waiting for us to stop," she said. The confessor flinched as though struck. "Blasphemy hides in despair, child. It speaks softly so you will not hear its poison. You must resist." She almost smiled at the irony. "And if the poison is truth?" A long pause. She heard him exhale. "Then the truth must burn. That is what faith is for, to survive the fire." His words should have comforted her. Instead, they echoed like hollow ritual. "Tell me," she said, "have you ever heard him?" "Truly?" the confessor's voice faltered. "Once," he whispered. "Or I thought I did, in the trenches of Hydrax IV during the Plague Wars. I called for deliverance and saw light through the smoke. I believed it was him. Perhaps it was only a flare. But if belief keeps a man alive, what difference does it make?" Celestine's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to reveal herself, to tell him that she was the flare, that she had been the light that men mistook for God. But the confession booth felt like a tomb, and she had no strength to resurrect herself from it. "Then we are all liars," she said quietly. "And our lies hold up the sky." The confessor did not answer. The silence stretched until she could hear the hum of the ship's reactors through the floor. At last he spoke, voice raw. "If you are a liar, then lie beautifully. The Emperor made us imperfect, so that we could still choose to believe. That choice is worship." When Celestine left the booth, she did not feel absolved. The priest remained behind the grill, weeping softly, perhaps for her, perhaps for himself. She wandered the outer corridors where the metal skin of the ship shuddered under warp tides. Through a narrow viewport, she saw the storms curling just beyond the Geller field. Rivers of light, shapes that moved like thought, colors that had no name. In that luminous chaos, she sensed presence. Not the Emperor, but something older, watching her with curiosity rather than judgment. "Are you listening?" she whispered to the void. "Or only reflecting what I want to see?" The warp shimmered in answer, and for a moment she thought she saw wings spread across infinity. Vast, formless, neither holy nor profane. Then the light folded in on itself, and the darkness returned. The ship trembled. Somewhere below, the engines screamed, and pilgrims began to pray louder, desperate to drown out the sound. Celestine pressed her palm against the cold glass, her wound aching beneath the bandage. The pain was real, immediate, human, and it was the only proof she had left of being alive. When she finally turned away, she whispered the old benediction without believing a word of it. "The Emperor protects," but this time she added what had always been missing. "And if he does not, then we must protect each other." Sleep came to her at last, unbidden and uneasy. The hum of the reliquary of dawn lulled her into it. The slow pulse of reactors and the low murmuring of prayers bleeding through the walls. But her dreams were not her own. They began as light, warm, golden, familiar, the same brilliance that had always heralded his presence. For a heartbeat, she felt peace. The warmth of the Emperor's radiance brushed her skin, and she almost believed she was whole again. But then the light began to flicker. It wavered like flame starved of air, dimming until she saw not radiance, but structure. A great hall unfolded before her, endless, silent, carved from gold that pulsed like living flesh. Thousands of chains hung from the vaults above, each thicker than a man's body, each trembling as though they held something vast. Their sound was soft, metallic, mournful. 1,000 sighs of weight endured. At the center, upon a throne that bled light, sat a figure. She knew him instantly, the Emperor of mankind, the master of humanity, the undying one. But he was not as she had imagined. Not radiant, not divine. His flesh was pale as parchment, stretched thin over bone and wire. The crown of light upon his brow was cracked, leaking brilliance like blood. Tubes and conduits pierced his body, feeding and draining, the machinery humming in rhythm with his breath, if breath it could be called. Celestine fell to her knees, trembling. "My lord," she whispered, "I have come to beg forgiveness. I have lost the light you gave me." The Emperor's eyes opened, not gold, but grey, dull, human, and yet when he looked at her, she felt the weight of stars pressing against her soul. "Forgiveness," came a voice that was not sound, but thought, heavy as gravity itself. "Forgiveness is a mortal invention," her lips trembled. "Then what am I, if not yours?" The figure regarded her for a long moment, and in that silence, she saw motion behind him. The chains tightening, glowing with each pulse of the throne's power. Through them, she glimpsed other shapes, shadows suspended in the light, faces without faces, souls without names. They writhed in agony, feeding the golden fire that burned around the Emperor's body. She understood then. The Astronomicon, the beacon of his will, the sacrifice of 1,000 souls for a light that must never go out. "You are what they need you to be," the voice said. "No more, no less," tears welled in her eyes. "Then you are not truly here," she whispered. The Emperor did not answer. The chains groaned, their song growing louder until it drowned her heartbeat. "Tell me," she pleaded, "do you hear us when we pray? Do you even know our names?" The air trembled, the light dimmed further, revealing the truth she did not wish to see. Beneath the throne, bound within the cables and holy circuitry, the Emperor's mouth moved, not in command, but in pain, and the sound he made was not speech, but a whisper of eternal suffering. Celestine screamed. The dream shattered. She woke, gasping, the air of the ship stale and cold against her skin. Her wound had reopened, bleeding through the bandage. The light above her bunk flickered erratically, bathing the room in alternating shadow and sickly gold. Someone was standing in the doorway. A young acolyte, barely grown, eyes wide and fearful. "Saint," the girl stammered. "Forgive me, I heard you cry out. I came to..." Celestine sat upright, clutching the edge of the cot. "How long was I asleep?" 3 days, the girl whispered. "We thought you had entered divine trance." Celestine laughed then, soft and broken. "Divine," she said. "Yes, something like that." The acolyte bowed and began to retreat. But Celestine stopped her. "Child," she said, "tell me, do you ever wonder if the Emperor suffers?" The girl froze, uncertain whether to answer. "Suffering is holy," she managed at last. "His pain lights the galaxy." Celestine nodded slowly. "Yes," she murmured. "That's what they say." When the girl left, Celestine sat in the dark for a long while, her thoughts circling like vultures over memory. The dream lingered. The chains, the whisper, the human eyes. She tried to tell herself it was a vision sent to test her, but deep down, she knew better. It had not been revelation. It had been recognition. And as the ship entered Terra's long orbit, the Astronomicon flared overhead, brighter than ever, a wound of light in the void. Celestine looked out the viewport and whispered, "If this is your glory, my lord, it is built on too much pain." The stars did not answer. Word spread faster than light, as it always did in the Imperium. By the time the reliquary of dawn descended upon Terra, the whispers had already preceded her. They called it the silence of the saint. Some said Celestine had spoken directly to the Emperor and returned wordless, her mind too full of his truth for mortal speech. Others claimed she had refused his command entirely, that she had turned from his light to walk among men as a creature of flesh and sorrow. Both versions were heresy. Both drew followers. Terra itself was a wound of gold. Its skies burned with the constant shimmer of orbital fire, its spires piercing the smog like bones breaking through old scars. Celestine had walked these streets long ago as a vision, a miracle, a beacon of incorruptible grace. Now she moved as one unseen, a pilgrim swallowed by the crowd. The pilgrims sang of her, though they did not know she stood among them. They carried banners painted with her likeness, radiant, arms outstretched, halo bright as dawn, but the words beneath the image were strange. She listens for us now. It began, she learned, with a single preacher, a woman of the Underhive who claimed that Celestine's silence was not loss, but revelation, that the saint had descended from the Emperor's side not to bring faith, but to learn it. The preacher's sermons spread like wildfire through the lower levels of the Hive, carried by vox, by rumor, by prayer. They called themselves the cult of reflection. Their creed was simple and dangerous. The Emperor's light shines only through the mirror of human belief. To the ecclesiarchy, it was blasphemy of the highest order. To the desperate, it was hope, a creed that made them participants in divinity, not mere beggars at its feet. Celestine wandered through their gatherings in the dark places beneath Terra's glittering cathedrals. The air smelled of incense and rust. Candles burned low, their smoke tracing spirals in the gloom. 1,000 voices whispered as one, "The saint has seen the truth. We are the light now." She stood at the edge of the crowd, hood drawn low, heart trembling. A child's voice rose from the murmur. "The Emperor is silent because he gave us his voice. The saint heard it first. Now she teaches us to listen." Celestine felt the weight of those words settle upon her like armor made of grief. She wanted to shout, to deny it, to tell them that she was no teacher, no prophet, only a woman who had failed to keep her faith alive. But she could not. The faces around her glowed with such fragile hope that to destroy it felt crueler than any heresy. At the front of the gathering stood the preacher herself, a woman blind in both eyes, her sockets sealed by melted wax. She wore robes of tattered silk. The aquila burned into her skin. When she spoke, her voice carried the rhythm of prophecy. "The saint has shown us the mirror," the preacher intoned. "And what we see there is not the Emperor looking down, but ourselves looking up. We are his reflection, and our faith is his flame. When we believe, he burns bright. When we doubt, he dims. So let the saint's silence remind us, and even the divine must be fed." A murmur swept through the crowd, half worship, half awe. Candles flared higher as if responding to the fervor. Celestine felt the heat lick against her skin, saw shadows dancing on the walls in strange, living shapes. This was not faith as she had known it, not devotion, but contagion, a living organism growing from the absence of God. After the sermon ended, she approached the preacher quietly. Up close, the woman seemed impossibly frail, her voice a rasp of wind. "Why do you use my name?" Celestine asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The preacher smiled, blind eyes glistening. "Because you gave us permission, Saint." "I did no such thing." The woman tilted her head. "You didn't need to. The moment you fell silent, the truth spoke for you." Celestine stared at her. "And what truth is that?" "That we no longer need to be saved. the preacher said softly. We only need to believe that we can save ourselves. Something inside Celestine broke, not from anger, but from recognition. The cult had not twisted her message. They had heard what she herself had been too afraid to say aloud. When she left the gathering, the candles behind her flared one final time, casting her shadow on the wall. Tall, winged, haloed. The faithful gasped, falling to their knees. But Celestine kept walking, her steps echoing through the tunnels. She did not look back, because for the first time, she realized that her silence had become a gospel all its own. They came for her under the false dawn of terror's smog-choked morning, crimson-robed adepts of the Adeptus Mechanicus, their footsteps precise, their voices whispering binary prayers through vox grills. Celestine had known they would. The rumors of her silence, of the cult that bore her name, had reached even the data vaults of Mars. To the priesthood of the machine god, miracles were equations waiting to be solved. She was taken without ceremony to the Basilica Mechanicum, a cathedral of steel and sanctified circuitry that hummed with the pulse of 1,000 reactors. Brass spires loomed overhead like organs built for a dead god. The air was sharp with ozone and incense, the mingled smell of faith and electricity. Magos Aster Val awaited her at the center of the chamber, surrounded by servo skulls that recorded every movement. His flesh was almost gone. Only one eye remained human, pale and exhausted beneath a crown of augmetic filigree. Saint Celestine, he greeted, voice split between vox tones and human rasp. We thank you for consenting to examination. I did not consent, she said quietly, but I will not resist. Resistance is irrelevant, Val replied. We seek truth, not submission. He gestured, and the servo skulls descended, bathing her in a lattice of red light. Your radiance once defied all quantification. Luminic readings, psionic resonance, thermal output, all inconsistent with natural law. Yet recent data indicates decline. You measure faith, she said. Do you think it will fit in your machines? Val's human eye twitched. We measure energy. Faith is merely a variable attached to power. When your miracles occur, the Astronomicon flickers in sympathetic pulse. When they do not, the signal stabilizes. There is correlation. Celestine felt the old ache stir in her chest, the wound that had never truly healed. You think the Emperor's light responds to me. We think, the Magos answered, that it responds to belief itself. The human mind is a transmitter. You are an amplifier. He turned a dial upon his data staff and the chamber dimmed. The red lattice brightened, outlining her form in cruel detail. Every scar, every fracture of bone and metal. The machines hummed louder as though in prayer. Observe, Val murmured. When you recall a miracle, even in memory, the readings surge. Celestine closed her eyes. Against her will, she remembered the old fire, the moment of ascension, the roar of faith as millions cried her name. Heat flushed through her body. The scanners screamed with static. Sparks leapt from the floor. Fascinating, Val whispered. You generate psychic luminosity proportional to recollection, not divine intercession. Self-sustained field reaction. Celestine opened her eyes. You mean illusion? Reality and illusion differ only by consensus, the Magos said. If enough minds believe the fire is real, the fire burns. If they stop believing, he stopped. The machines fell silent. The lights dimmed to nothing. Celestine stepped forward, her voice barely more than a whisper. Finish it, Magos. If they stop believing, he said at last, you die. The words hung in the still air. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Celestine reached for his staff and crushed the crystal node in her bare hand. The room exploded in a shower of sparks. Servo skulls screamed and fell to the floor like burning cherubs. You seek to define faith by numbers, she said, her voice low, shaking. But faith is not a current to be measured. It is what remains when all the power has failed. Val backed away, one augmetic hand raised in protest. Saint, please, the data. Burn it, she said. He hesitated. Burn it, she repeated, and this time the steel in her tone left no space for obedience to logic. The Magos inclined his head. As you will. But remember, if faith is fuel, then you are the pyre. Celestine left the basilica before the alarms finished echoing. The sky outside was a dull brass color, streaked with the exhaust of shuttle traffic. She could still smell ozone on her skin. In her palm, where the data crystal had shattered, the flesh was torn, another wound that would not heal. She looked up toward the heavens where the Astronomicon pulsed faintly through the clouds, its light steady once more. For a heartbeat, she wondered if Val had been right, if her faltering belief had dimmed that sacred flame, and if the Emperor's strength was nothing more than the sum of theirs. The thought sickened her, but beneath the sickness came something else: defiance. If the divine could die from disbelief, then faith was no longer worship. It was rebellion against extinction. Celestine drew her cloak tighter and walked into the storm. The rain on Terra was always grey. It carried the dust of 1 billion engines, the ashes of saints long burned, and the prayers of the forgotten. Celestine walked through it without her cloak, letting the filth stain her armor. Each drop hissed against the relic plate, as though daring it to corrode. She welcomed the sound. Everywhere she went, she heard her own name turned into litany. Street preachers whispered of a saint who had looked into the Emperor's silence and found something greater. Shrines had begun to change. The artists painted her not blazing with fire, but haloed in shadow. Eyes downcast, hands open. The saint who listens, she should have condemned it. She should have demanded purity of doctrine. Instead, she listened, because within the distortion, she heard something true. In a courtyard beneath the spire of the Administratum, she found the dying gathered around a fountain that no longer flowed. Pilgrims huddled in the rain, whispering their confessions to one another. No priests, no hierarchy, just people trying to believe together. A woman with augmetic limbs sang softly, her voice breaking. "We are the light we pray for." Celestine knelt among them. When the woman recognized her, she gasped and tried to kneel, but the saint stopped her with a touch. "No titles," Celestine said. "Just faith." The woman nodded, tears mixing with the rain. "Then pray with us." So Celestine did. Not to the Emperor, not to any god. She prayed to the idea that belief itself could heal, that humanity's stubborn refusal to despair might be holy enough. A warmth answered her, small but real. It came not from the heavens, but from the crowd around her, from their trembling voices rising in shared hope. The sensation was fragile, human, and beautiful. For the first time, she did not fear it. That night, she climbed the outer bastions of the ecclesiastical palace. The city sprawled below like a wound of light, and above it, the Astronomicon burned in its steady rhythm. She knelt on the edge, wind tearing at her ruined wings. "If belief sustains you," she whispered to the stars, "then let mine be a spark, not a chain." Something stirred behind her, the scrape of ceramite on stone. A figure stepped into view, armored in gold, a custodian guard, sentinel of the Emperor's temple. His helm hid his face, but his voice carried the weight of 10,000 oaths. "Saint Celestine, you should not be here." "Neither should he," she said softly. The custodian hesitated. "You speak treason. I speak truth." She turned to face him, rain streaming down her face like tears. "You guard a corpse on a throne and call it eternity. But if the Emperor's will truly flows through his people, then perhaps we are what remains of his divinity." The custodian's gauntlets clenched. Such words unmake empires. Perhaps they must be unmade to be reborn. For a moment, only the storm answered. Then the custodian stepped aside. "Go," he said, "before my duty remembers itself." Celestine passed him without another word. She descended into the city's depths, where the cult of reflection had gathered once more. They greeted her not with chants, but with silence, reverent and expectant. At the center of the crowd stood the blind preacher, her wax-sealed eyes turned toward the sound of rain. "Saint," the woman whispered, "we felt your pain in the heavens. It shook the Astronomicon." Celestine stepped forward. "No, you shook it. Your faith did. You don't need my miracles, only each other." The preacher's lips parted in wonder. "Then what are you, if not divine?" Celestine smiled faintly. "A witness, nothing more." But even as she said it, a faint light began to gather around her. Not the blinding fire of old, but a soft human glow, the reflection of countless eyes watching her, believing. It rose like dawn in miniature, filling the cavern with warmth. The crowd fell to their knees. The preacher wept. "The light returns," she cried. Celestine looked down at her hands, trembling with the glow of mortal faith, and felt no shame. This was not heresy. This was hope. "If this is sin," she whispered, "then let it be sanctified by what it saves." Outside, the storm broke, scattering the clouds. For a brief instant, the Astronomicon brightened, just enough for navigators in distant systems to mark it in awe. None knew why, Celestine did. She felt it in the rhythm of her heartbeat, in the chorus of prayers that no longer needed heaven to be heard. The call reached her across the void like a dying heartbeat. A world at the edge of Imperial charts, Sindara 9, was burning. Its defenders begged for deliverance, invoking her name as though it were a weapon. The cults that had sprung from her silence now prayed for her return. And so, against reason and decree, Celestine came. The journey through the warp was a blur of crimson storms and ghostly song. The Astra Invicta, an ancient warship crewed by Sisters of Battle and the remnants of the Reliquary's pilgrims, carried her through the tempest. Each night she stood before the viewing port and watched the warp press against the hull like an ocean of living glass. Once she would have drawn strength from the Emperor's beacon, now she drew it from memory, from faces, voices, faith unbroken. When the ship emerged into real space, Sindara 9 was already half ash. Orbiting manufactorums burned like suns. The Hive cities below pulsed with gunfire. Reports said heretics marched under banners of black scripture, claiming the Emperor's throne for themselves. The planet was dying not because of disbelief, but because of belief twisted beyond reason. Celestine armed herself in silence. Her armor no longer shone, its gold dulled to bronze, its wings frayed and scarred. Yet when she stepped into the landing craft, every soldier knelt, not from awe, from recognition. They followed her because she bled. The descent was chaos. The transport shook under anti-air fire. Flak bloomed like diseased stars. Through the view slit, she saw the city below, a labyrinth of ruin, streets choked with bodies, cathedrals half collapsed under their own prayers. The Vox crackled with desperate hymns. They landed hard amid the skeletal ruins of a shrine to the Aquila. The moment the ramp fell, the smell of promethium and death engulfed them. The heretics were already upon the lines. Gaunt men painted in ash, chanting that the saint who doubted would lead them to freedom from gods. Celestine drew her sword. The blade kindled, weak, flickering, but enough. She waded into the melee, each swing a confession, each wound a verse of absolution. Bolter shells screamed past her head. Lasfire flashed across her armor, leaving trails of molten gold. Around her, the sisters fought with grim ferocity, their faith no longer blind but chosen. The battle was not a miracle. It was mud, smoke, and screaming, but it was real. When a shell struck the barricade beside her, Celestine fell among the rubble. Her ears rang, her vision blurred. She dragged herself upright and saw a young guardsman beside her, bleeding from the throat. He met her gaze, eyes wide. "Saint," he croaked. "Say it. Say the words." She leaned close, pressing her forehead to his. "The Emperor protects," she whispered, and for once she believed it, not as promise, but as choice. The man died smiling. She rose again, sword blazing brighter than before, not divine, but human fire, born from the hands that still fought beside her, from the voices shouting her name, not as worship, but as rallying cry.
"Celestine! Celestine!"
The heretics faltered. They saw no angel descending, only a woman aflame with defiance, and somehow that terrified them more. As night fell, the Imperials pushed forward inch by inch until the square before the Basilica Prometheia was theirs again. The wounded were dragged to cover. The dead were lined along the walls like offerings. Celestine stood in the rain of ash, breathing hard, her wings heavy with soot. Every joint ached, every nerve screamed. She felt alive. A sister approached, Livia, scarred, armored in blackened plate. "You should rest, my lady," she said. "The men won't stop until you do," Celestine smiled faintly. "They won't stop because they've remembered what they are." Livia looked at her sword. "It burns again." Celestine followed her gaze. The blade glowed softly, not with celestial brilliance, but with a steady, earthly warmth. "I think it burns because we do," she said. Distant thunder rolled, the sound of tanks, of another assault gathering. Celestine turned toward it, feeling the weight of destiny settle like armor around her shoulders. There would be no victory carved by miracle, no salvation written in light, only survival, and the faith that survival could mean something. She lifted her sword high, its glow mirrored in 1,000 weary eyes. "Hold the line," she called. "Not for me, for one another." And the army moved as one. The night swallowed them in fire and storm. Celestine led the charge into the dark, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, the void above Sindara 9 shimmered. The Astronomicon pulsed brighter, as if answering a prayer it did not understand. But Celestine did not look up. Her eyes were on the ground ahead, where humanity still fought to stand. The storm lasted 3 days. By the third, there was no sky left, only a ceiling of smoke, broken by the white flash of orbital bombardments and the distant hum of war engines dying in orbit. The city was gone, replaced by a grave of fire. Celestine moved through it like the ghost of what she had been, her sword dull, her wings reduced to bone and ash. The battle had turned. The heretics had called reinforcements, twisted things that wore human flesh like mockery. Demons, half-born from the fever of belief gone wrong. They crawled from the corpses of the faithful, wearing their prayers as wounds. Every time one fell, 2 more rose, feeding on fear. Celestine fought until her body was little more than pain stitched together by will. She could feel her bones grind with each step, her heart hammering too fast, too fragile. Around her, the sisters dwindled. The banners of the Imperium burned. She saw Livia fall, struck down by a creature that still had a child's face. The saint ran to her, cutting the demon down with one last ragged swing. She caught Livia's body before it hit the ground. "My lady," the sister breathed, blood seeping between her teeth. Celestine shook her head. "No titles, not anymore," Livia smiled weakly. Then, "Goodbye, Celestine." The light left her eyes. Celestine pressed her forehead to the woman's brow, whispering words that had no prayer left in them, only gratitude. Then came the sound, low, terrible, rising like the groan of a dying world. The enemy's war engines moved through the fog, titanic silhouettes wreathed in warp flame. The Imperial line fractured. Someone called her name, not in worship this time, but in desperation. Celestine rose. Her armor hung in tatters, her wounds bleeding freely. The sword in her hand felt impossibly heavy. She could not win. She knew that now, but she could stand. She stepped into the open square, the heart of the ruined Basilica Promethea, and looked upon the advancing horde. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, yet it carried through the storm like a hymn. "You wanted a god," she said, "but you were given a woman, and still, I will not kneel." She raised her blade. The glow returned, faint at first, then growing, fed by the eyes that watched her, by the hearts that refused to look away. The surviving sisters rallied behind her, their voices breaking into song. Not the old hymns, not the ecclesiarchy's sterile litanies, but something raw, born of pain and faith remade. The heretics screamed and charged. Celestine met them head-on. Her wings flared one final time, not gold but red, each feather a spark torn from the fire that consumed her. She cut through the first ranks, her sword tracing arcs of light that lingered even as her strength failed. Every wound she took bled brilliance. Every breath she drew burned. Bolt of fire shattered her pauldron. A spear of bone pierced her abdomen. She stumbled but did not fall. Each step was agony, yet she moved forward, each heartbeat a miracle wrought by sheer defiance. Her final blow came against a creature of impossible form, a demon bound in scripture and flesh. They clashed in silence, the roar of battle fading until there was only the sound of her breathing. She drove her sword through its chest, even as its claws tore open her own. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Then the demon dissolved into ash. Celestine fell to her knees. The sword slipped from her hand. The light around her began to fade, but it did not vanish. It spread, not upward, not toward the heavens, but outward, into the soldiers who still fought, into the dying who still clung to hope. One by one, their weapons glowed faintly. Their eyes blazed with belief reborn. Celestine looked up at the blood-red sky. She could no longer see the Astronomicon, only smoke and ruin. "If this is death," she whispered, "then let it be my offering." She pressed her hand to the wound in her chest, feeling the pulse slowing beneath her palm. "The Emperor protects," she said, and this time the words felt right. A warmth spread through her, soft as sunrise. The pain ebbed. Around her, the last of the sisters took up her cry, their voices rising into the storm. "The Emperor protects." Celestine smiled. The rain fell harder, washing the blood from her face, from the broken stones, from the hands that reached for her as she sank to the ground. Her wings unfurled one last time, catching the light. For a moment, every soul who saw her believed she was ascending. But there was no ascent, only light dissolving into the air, joining the breath of those who still lived. And then she was gone. The square was silent except for the rain. In the void above, the Astronomicon pulsed once, bright as dawn, then steady again. Morning came quietly, as though the planet itself feared to wake her. Sindara 9 was a ruin of glass and ash, yet for the first time in memory, the air did not taste of smoke. The guns had fallen silent. The clouds thinned, revealing a bruised sky washed pale by the first true light it had seen in months. In the square where the Basilica Promethea once stood, the survivors gathered. They found no body, only her sword, half buried in the mud, its surface dulled to the color of morning steel. Around it, the ground still glowed faintly, as though the memory of fire refused to fade. They did not call it a miracle. Not yet, they were too tired for miracles. They simply knelt and bowed their heads, whispering her name, not as worship, but as remembrance. Across the city, word spread that the saint had fallen. Some said she had risen into the sky, her wings becoming the storm that saved them. Others swore they had seen her walking the line of the wounded, her hands warm upon their brows. No two stories matched, yet none doubted that she had been there. In orbit, the Astra Invicta watched the surface through shattered sensors. Every auger reading was the same. Faint residual energy, human in origin, radiating from the basilica ruins like a heartbeat. The tech priests could not classify it. The sisters called it faith. Days passed. The dead were burned. The living buried their names in prayer. Life, stubborn as ever, began to take root again. Children scavenged among the ruins, chasing one another through corridors where hymns had once echoed. A single flower, white, thin, fragile, pushed through the cracks of the cathedral steps. Livia's banner was raised above the square, patched and torn, but it caught the wind. Beneath it, the survivors built a shrine. Not grand, not gilded, just stone shaped by tired hands. At its center stood the sword. No one polished it. No one dared. It remained as it was the day they found it. Weathered, human, honest. On the 40th day, a courier ship brought a message from Terra. The ecclesiarchy had declared the silence of the saint a heresy. Pilgrims were forbidden to speak her name, her likeness purged from cathedrals. Yet even as the edict spread, so did the opposite. Secret gatherings, whispered prayers, quiet candles lit in forgotten corners. They did not worship Celestine the divine. They remembered Celestine the human. The cults of reflection evolved into something gentler, less a rebellion than a promise. Their creed was written on scraps of parchment and walls of ruined hives. Faith is not the Emperor's gift. It is ours to give back. On distant worlds, soldiers carried those words into battle. On Terra itself, an old confessor who had once spoken with her rewrote his sermons, speaking of silence not as judgment, but as invitation. The Mechanicus, too, noticed something strange. The Astronomicon had stabilized. Not brightened, not dimmed, simply held steady, constant as breath. No one could explain it. Theories were written, data gathered, miracles denied. But in the quiet of the void, navigators swore the light felt warmer. And far away, some said on a world without name, others deep within the black between stars, a woman walked alone. Her armor was gone, her wings only scars upon her back. Yet her eyes burned softly with the color of sunrise. She did not know where she was going, only that the path led forward. Each world she passed felt the faint tremor of hope in her wake, as though the universe itself remembered the echo of her heart. Sometimes she dreamed of Terra, of golden halls and chains that reached into eternity. But now, when she saw the Emperor upon his throne, she no longer begged for his voice. She only bowed her head and whispered, "Rest." When she woke, she would stand again, brush the dust from her hands, and keep walking. For in the endless dark, even one step taken in belief was enough to keep the light alive. The chronicles would end there. The records would disagree. But the last line written by an unnamed scribe in the ruins of Sindara 9 endured for centuries. She did not ascend into heaven. She descended into us, and somewhere in the deep silence between stars, the Astronomicon pulsed once more. Steady, patient, alive.